Hello, thanks for joining us for our True Crime series, a joint venture between Port Phillip Library Services and Sisters in Crime Australia. I'm Karina Kilmore, a journalist and crime writer. Today, I'm here with Soren Blau. Soren is an identification and forensic specialist and has been involved in recovery and analysis of human remains for cases around the world. She is talking to us today about how science has changed the criminal landscape. Soren, is it possible these days to get away with murder or kidnapping? Forensic science seems to have outsmarted most killers.
Oh, good morning, Karina. Yes, look, I think in principle, you might say it is still possible, but I think it's become increasingly difficult for a range of reasons, most notably, I think, with the improvement of the processes, both in the search, recovery and analysis of a range of different forensic evidence.
Yeah. And what sort of, what has been the most important forensic development during the past 10 or 20 years? And how do you think that might have changed criminal behaviour?
I mean, probably if we think back, nearly 40 years now, evidently the discovery of DNA played a phenomenal role in the investigation of crime. And I think it's also fair to say that within the last 20 years, we've seen, again, a rapid sort of technological improvement and development of DNA. So everything from the ability of DNA to potentially predict someone's appearance, so their eye colour, their hair colour, what's called DNA phenotyping, where that person may have come from. We've seen developments in genetic genealogy, so the ability to use, probably everyone will be familiar with the DNA.com, My Ancestry, etc. Use those databases again to as a forensic investigative tool. So I think that's a very, prevalent space which we've seen change. I would also suggest that probably one of the most important changes has been the way in which forensic experts are now accountable. So it used to be, for example, in court, there was a bit of a tendency to be able to say, trust me, I'm an expert. There's been a range, as your listeners are probably aware, of problems with that and resulting in convictions that, were obviously wrongful. Now, there's just such an emphasis on looking at the evidence base which is present, upon which we as experts make our interpretations. And that really cuts across all disciplines. And that really, I would suggest, would be one of the most important changes in this space.
And what about scientific? I mean, that's a procedural change, isn't it? The collection and supporting evidence. What about a scientific change? Has there been one thing? I mean, DNA you mentioned, is
yeah, look, yeah. I'm not a DNA expert, but I mean, the work I'm involved in is a collaborative approach. So, I'm very aware of those changes. I can't off the top of my head in the space that I work with identify a particular, trend or change that's been so dynamic in terms of the scientific technique. As I said, the work I'm particularly involved in terms of identification definitely leans into that space of DNA and the changes that I've kind of outlined. So
yeah, great. You're a missing person specialist. How do you go about finding and identifying someone?
Yeah, so identification in its first principle really depends on preservation. So in our context, a deceased person who would come into our care, for example, I work at the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine, most people are visually identifiable, and that is where a family member or someone who's known that person for at least 6 months will come and view that deceased individual and make a statement. Ultimately, the finalisation of identification is the remit of the coroner. So that, we're fortunate in most cases, that is the process. Of course, sadly, there are a number of cases for various reasons why a person may not be visually identifiable. And that is where the coroner then requires what we call a scientific process of identification. And again, in general, that will depend, that may involve DNA, might involve fingerprints, it might involve looking at dental records. And as I speak, you can see that depending on preservation, so if someone's fully skeletonized, for example, fingerprints is then not an option. This scientific process also depends on the ability for us as experts to locate what we call ante-mortem information. So if we take the example of a fingerprint identification, not everyone in Australia has a fingerprint record. If you commit a crime or you go purchase a firearm, you will have a fingerprint record. So for those cases, that's quite useful. But if we can't find, for example, dental records, then dental identification becomes very difficult. So each case is really, reviewed in its own entity. So the circumstances, how well preserved the individual is. Again, if we go right down and we only have a single bone, you can appreciate we're very limited. In those sorts of cases, we use the expertise of a forensic anthropologist. So the analysis of the skeletal element might tell you their male, an age, for example. If we had the skull, then we could talk about ancestry. And then ultimately, we might go for DNA in these cases. But again, we go full circle that DNA identification requires something to compare it with. So we might get a very nice profile from taking a bone sample and trying to extract DNA from the bone, but we have to have a hypothesis of, if we think this person might be John Brown, can we go and request a family reference DNA sample from John Brown's family, for example, to make that comparison. So it does become quite complex. And as I said, each case really is assessed in its own its own right, just to see, which elements are present to assist that process.
Yeah, wow. You've also worked with the International Criminal Court and the International Committee of the Red Cross. What types of cases did these involve?
So the range of cases in this sort of international space really varies. So it may be cases, for example, where the request has come through for a truth commission. So some work that I've done in the Solomon Islands or West Africa, where there's been conflict. There's now a peace accord that transpires, and both sides are trying to reconcile through a transitional peace process. And in these sorts of situations, we find that there's very strong evidence that the physical evidence, so exhuming deceased individuals from both sides of the conflict, does help in that march towards peace and hopefully, justice is a different issue. But so in those sorts of cases, we've worked, as I've mentioned, exhuming deceased individuals from both sides, and then working with families to try and help identify the individuals. So those sorts of cases are really what we call humanitarian identification. As I mentioned, there's no sense of justice. We know in most cases that an atrocity has been committed, perhaps from both sides. But as I mentioned, really for the families and to try and give a way to, move forward. The role of anthropology, and in those cases archaeology, so with the exhumation of remains, has been very valuable. So work for organisations such as the International Criminal Court, of course, have a legal justice issue. So work that I was privileged to take part in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, there had been conflict, and again, alleged atrocities had been committed. A person was apprehended, and the ICC, so the International Criminal Court, was in the process of trying to collect evidence to prosecute this particular individual. And as we've seen, certainly since the 90s with the violence in the former Yugoslavia, the power of physical evidence to prosecute, and particularly forensic medical evidence, so in fact that the deceased bodies, has been extraordinary. And that really did set a precedence for the work of the International Criminal Court. So that particular work involved working with witnesses who had alleged to have seen particular events, trying to locate where these people had been ultimately buried or dumped, then either proving or denying those witness statements, then using traditional archaeological techniques, but in a forensic landscape, to recover the individuals, but of course any associated evidence that might give weight to particular investigation. And so in that instance, and this is often the case where the pursuit of evidence for justice then doesn't necessarily mean that there will be an identification of those deceased. So often there's quite a conflict, I think. Both, as you can imagine, both processes have an extremely valuable side to the evidence. Ultimately, I think in an ideal state, we would like to see both. So recovery of evidence for justice purposes, with also the ability to, identify and give families their loved ones back.
Yeah, gosh. That sounds like harrowing work. I mean, as an academic and an expert, how do you compartmentalise the work you do within your wider life?
Look, Karina, it's not, for me, I find it a real privilege. I mean, I think there are a really select group of people who have expertise in this space. And, I believe that we have an obligation to help where we can. I think it's true that it's always astounding what humans can do to other humans. But no, I don't find it difficult to compartmentalize. It is part of my job. And, as I mentioned, for me, it really is a privilege to be able to, in my particular area of interest, to give individuals back their identity.
Yeah.
And where I can obviously provide evidence in court as well.
Yeah. Wow, fascinating. Soren Blau, thanks for talking with us today. It's been absolutely wonderful hearing your unique first-hand accounts. If you'd like to find out more about Soren, you can find her bio and website link in the information about this event series. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Bye.